It's Monday, August 24th, 2026. 90 knots. That's how fast Iran's newest generation of swarm boats can move across open water. Boats the IRGC spent years building an entire naval doctrine around. Boats designed to do exactly one thing: overwhelm a warship through sheer numbers before anyone on board can react. And for decades, that doctrine actually worked as a threat, because how do you stop 50 small boats converging on one destroyer from every direction at once? Well, it turns out the answer wasn't a bigger gun or a bigger missile. It was something almost nobody outside military circles was paying attention to until this year, and it just turned Iran's signature naval weapon into a liability instead of an asset. Let's talk about how Iran's swarm navy, the entire strategy Tehran built its Gulf doctrine around, ran straight into the one thing it was never designed to fight. So here's the doctrine first, because you need to understand what Iran actually built before you understand how it got dismantled. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has never tried to match the United States Navy hull for hull, dollar for dollar, because that's a fight they were always going to lose. Instead, they built what's called an asymmetric naval strategy, and the core of it is the swarm. Dozens, sometimes over 100, small, high-speed boats, some carrying rockets, some carrying torpedoes, some rigged as floating bombs, all capable of launching from hidden coves and small islands scattered across the Persian Gulf, then converging on a single target from multiple bearings simultaneously. The idea is simple and honestly pretty smart on paper. A warship's radar and fire control systems can only track and engage so many contacts at once, and if you throw enough cheap, fast boats at it from enough directions, you create a saturation problem that even the most advanced Aegis system struggles to solve cleanly. Iran has spent years publicly showing off exactly this capability, staging exercises where dozens of boats race across the water in serpentine formations, broadcasting the footage specifically to remind the world that this waterway comes with a built-in cost if anyone tries to challenge them on it. And it wasn't just theater. IRGC boats have a long documented history of doing this for real against actual American ships, not just in drills. There have been repeated incidents over the years of Iranian fast boats closing dangerously on U.S. destroyers, weapons uncovered, no response on the radio, sailors having to sound horns just to keep them from closing distance any further. This is a tactic with a track record, and Tehran leaned into it hard, commissioning wave after wave of new boats specifically built for this mission. Just look at how the program evolved. Speeds climbing generation over generation, 55 knots, then 75, then 90, with the next generation reportedly targeting 110. Boats fitted with missiles, rockets, lightweight torpedoes, all operating under Iran's own indigenous radar network, so the whole swarm could coordinate without depending on outside systems that could be jammed or disrupted. This wasn't a hobby project. This was a real, funded, doctrinally central pillar of how Iran planned to defend the Strait of Hormuz, and if it ever came to it, threatened to sink far larger American vessels through sheer numbers. So when this current conflict actually kicked off earlier this year, Iran did exactly what its own doctrine said to do. It closed the Strait of Hormuz outright, and it backed that closure with the full layered version of everything it had spent years building. Limpet mines seated across the seafloor. Swarms of fast attack boats positioned to encircle and harass any vessel that tried to move, and buried deep into the mountains along the northern coastline, hardened underground missile sites housing anti-ship cruise missiles, the kind of long-range insurance policy meant to guarantee that even if the boats got dealt with, Iran could still reach out and strike shipping from a safe distance. On paper, that's a genuinely difficult problem to solve. 3 separate layers, mines, boats, and missiles, all working together to make transiting that strait too costly, too chaotic, and too slow for anyone to actually attempt it. Commercial traffic through Hormuz, which normally runs somewhere around 138 ships a day, essentially collapsed. Insurers pulled coverage. Shipping companies rerouted or just stopped moving cargo through the corridor entirely. For a moment, it looked like Iran's doctrine had actually worked exactly the way it was designed to. And then the United States didn't respond the way Iran's doctrine assumed it would. Because here's the thing about fighting an asymmetric threat built around overwhelming a manned crew's attention and a ship's fire control bandwidth. The obvious counter isn't to throw more expensive manned assets into that same saturation problem. It's to take the human decision-making bottleneck out of the equation entirely and replace it with something that doesn't get overwhelmed, doesn't need sleep, doesn't have a limited number of eyes, and is cheap enough that losing one doesn't actually matter. That's exactly what the Navy had quietly been building for years under a program most people had never heard of, and it's exactly what got thrown into this fight the moment things escalated. Meet the GARC, the Global Autonomous Reconnaissance Craft, built by a company called Black Sea Technologies, and honestly, it looks almost unremarkable if you just glance at it. 16 feet long, roughly 4,800 pounds fully loaded, powered by a 200 horsepower engine, carrying up to 1,000 pounds of payload. It's not flashy. It doesn't look like the future of naval warfare sitting on a dock, but it doesn't need a crew. It doesn't need a remote pilot glued to a joystick the entire time, and it can patrol continuously for hundreds of hours at a stretch. During its combat deployment against Iran, GARC boats accumulated more than 450 operational hours and covered over 2,200 nautical miles in the Hormuz zone alone, under an operation the Navy designated Epic Rage. Think about what that actually means operationally. A boat that never gets fatigued, never needs a shift change, never has a crew member who has to blink at the wrong moment, sitting on station continuously, watching, tracking, queuing other assets, the second something suspicious shows up on the water. And GARC wasn't operating alone out there. Alongside it, the Navy pushed forward Corsair unmanned surface vessels built by a company called Saronic, and these weren't just patrol and reconnaissance platforms. These were used as actual offensive strike weapons, marking the first time in history that the U.S. military employed unmanned surface vessels as strike assets in real combat. In a single wave of coordinated attacks against dozens of Iranian targets, 3 Corsair USVs struck the port facility at Bandar Abbas Naval Base directly, and separately, robotic strike craft were used to hit an Iranian Ghadir-class diesel-electric midget submarine. Let that sink in for a second. Unmanned boats, no sailors on board, no pilot risking their life, taking out a submarine and a naval maintenance facility in the same operational window. That's not a patrol mission anymore. That's a robotic strike fleet operating with real lethality against high-value targets. And it's a capability that simply didn't exist in any meaningful combat-proven form before this exact conflict forced the Navy to actually deploy it at scale. So picture the actual battle space Iran's swarm boats were suddenly operating in. Every cove, every hidden inlet, every small island where boats used to stage undetected before converging on a target, now sat under the persistent, tireless gaze of autonomous surface craft that don't need to go home at the end of a shift. The entire premise of the swarm doctrine, catch the enemy off guard, overwhelm them with numbers before they can properly track and respond, depends on some element of surprise and some limit on how much the defender can actually watch at once. Robotic boats that can loiter for hundreds of hours and feed real-time tracking data back into a networked system erase that assumption almost entirely. You can't ambush something that never stops watching. But the ghost boats were only one layer of what actually happened, because at the exact same time this unmanned picket line was going up, the United States was also going after the other 2 legs of Iran's strategy directly. Iran's underground missile sites near Hormuz had been built specifically to survive conventional airstrikes, decades-old tunnels, hardened concrete silos dug deep enough that ordinary bombs simply couldn't reach the systems buried inside. So the response to that wasn't an ordinary bomb. It was the deployment of massive bunker-buster munitions, 5,000-pound class weapons with a thick steel casing engineered to punch through more than 60 meters of soil or 20 meters of reinforced concrete, before detonating from inside the structure, collapsing it from within rather than just cratering the surface above it. The first real-world combat use of that specific capability came against Iranian coastal missile sites in mid-March of this year, as part of the broader operation that's since become known as Operation Epic Fury. And the results were about as decisive as this kind of strike gets. U.S. Central Command later stated that those strikes reduced Iran's missile stockpile along the entire Hormuz corridor by roughly 90%, effectively wiping out the long-range insurance policy that Iran had built its entire choke point strategy around. If the boats couldn't get close and the missile sites couldn't reach out from a distance either, the layered strategy Iran had spent years constructing was suddenly missing 2 of its 3 legs at once, which left the boats, and this is where the more traditional side of American air power came back into the story in a big way. Because you don't need exotic robotic technology to deal with a small, fast attack boat once you've already stripped away its ability to hide and its ability to coordinate under long-range missile cover. You just need an aircraft that's genuinely built to hunt slow-moving targets at low altitude with overwhelming firepower, and there's really only one platform on Earth that fits that description, as well as the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Type II, equipped with the 30mm GAU 8 Avenger cannon, capable of putting out 3,900 rounds per minute, that airframe is more than capable of shredding a small boat's hull in a matter of seconds. And because the A-10 flies low and slow by design, exactly the opposite of what most modern fighter doctrine emphasizes, it could keep Iranian skiffs under constant visual tracking, denying them the ability to duck behind waves, tuck in close to small islands, or disappear into the clutter along the coastline the way they'd been trained to do for years. Working alongside them, AH-64E Apache helicopters brought Hellfire missiles and their own onboard cannons into the mix, specifically hunting the mobile coastal batteries and smaller boats that tried to peel off and slip in behind the main formation once the swarm started taking losses. Between the robotic pickets watching everything, the bunker busters gutting the missile sites, and manned aircraft built specifically to hunt small, fast targets at low altitude, Iran's swarm boats found themselves fighting in an environment that had been completely reshaped against every single assumption their doctrine was built on. And it's worth pausing here to actually appreciate how fast this all happened, because that speed matters just as much as the individual pieces of technology involved. This wasn't a slow, multi-year campaign of attrition. This was a matter of days. The IRGC had declared the strait closed, believing they'd sealed it decisively enough to make reopening it too costly and too chaotic for anyone to attempt. And in a matter of days, the very architecture they'd built to hold that choke point began to crumble, piece by piece, layer by layer, until what had looked like an impenetrable trap turned into a battle space where Iran's most prized asymmetric weapon simply couldn't operate the way it was designed to. It's also worth talking about the laser weapon angle here, because it's easy to assume the entire counter-swarm solution came down to unmanned boats and air power, when the Navy has actually been quietly building toward this exact scenario for well over a decade. Long before this current conflict ever started, the Navy had already begun experimenting with directed energy weapons, specifically designed to answer the small boat swarm problem, deploying early laser cannon prototypes aboard amphibious ships stationed in the Gulf specifically to test whether a weapon that costs pennies per shot to fire could reliably knock out small, fast-moving targets without burning through expensive missile inventory. Those early systems demonstrated real promise in testing, destroying every single drone and small boat target thrown at them during evaluation runs. And alongside directed energy, the Navy separately pursued precision-guided cannon rounds through a program aimed at bringing smart targeting to fast-firing light cannons already mounted on destroyers, specifically so a ship facing a wave of small attack boats wouldn't have to choose between wasting a multi-million-dollar interceptor missile on a boat worth a few $1,000s or relying purely on unguided cannon fire and hoping for the best. Both of those programs matured quietly in the background for years, largely disconnected from headlines, until this exact kind of swarm confrontation gave them a real combat environment to prove their worth in alongside the newer robotic surface vessels. Put all of that together, and you start to see the actual shape of what happened to Iran's swarm doctrine this year. It wasn't one silver bullet system that broke it. It was the simultaneous maturation of about half a dozen separate programs, unmanned surveillance and strike boats, precision-guided cannon rounds, bunker-busting munitions capable of reaching hardened underground sites, low-altitude cannon-armed aircraft built specifically for hunting small moving targets, and years of accumulated doctrine on how to network all of it together into a single layered response, all converging at exactly the moment Iran decided to test its swarm strategy for real instead of just parading it around in exercises. Any one of those pieces alone probably wouldn't have been enough to unravel a doctrine Iran had spent 2 decades building. Together, deployed in a coordinated campaign over the span of days rather than months, they dismantled it almost completely. Now, Iran didn't just sit back and accept this quietly, and it's important to be honest about that too, because this wasn't a one-sided beatdown without any pushback at all. Iranian forces adapted in real time, and one of the more unsettling adaptations was the emergence of explosive-laden drone boats disguised as ordinary wooden fishing vessels, blending directly into the background clutter of legitimate maritime traffic moving through the strait. That's a genuinely difficult problem because now every small boat on the water becomes a potential threat that needs to be evaluated instead of dismissed, and it puts enormous pressure on exactly the kind of persistent, wide-area surveillance that the GARC network was built to provide in the first place. There were confirmed strikes against actual commercial tankers using these disguised, unmanned surface vehicles, vessels hit by explosive charges delivered via small boats that looked, right up until the moment of impact, like nothing more than local fishing craft. A Marshall Islands flagged tanker became one of the first vessels struck this way, and additional tankers were hit by similar remote-controlled explosive boats in the weeks that followed. So this fight was not purely one-directional. Iran adapted its tactics, leaned harder into deception and disguise once the open swarm approach started taking heavy losses, and forced the United States and its partners to widen exactly what kind of small craft they had to treat as a legitimate threat. But here's the strategic problem with that adaptation. And it's the same problem underlying basically every move Iran has tried to make in this entire conflict. Disguising boats as fishing vessels might buy you a tactical surprise here and there, but it doesn't solve the fundamental issue that started this entire unraveling in the first place, which is that Iran no longer has uncontested control over what happens on that water. Every disguised boat that gets identified and neutralized costs Iran another asset it can't easily replace, especially with sanctions choking off the specialized components that go into these systems. And every successful American or coalition detection of a disguised threat makes the next disguise attempt less effective because it teaches the surveillance network what to look for. You can't out-innovate a persistent robotic picket line by getting slightly craftier about camouflage when that same network is continuously learning and continuously watching. It's a losing arms race for the side that has to keep manufacturing cheap, disposable, disguised boats against an opponent that just has to keep improving its detection algorithms. Let's talk numbers for a second on the American side, because the coalition response to all of this wasn't purely a unilateral American operation either, and that matters for understanding just how comprehensively Iran's swarm strategy got boxed in. By mid-March, key allies including Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada issued a joint statement specifically pledging to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz for commercial shipping, and a broader coalition of 22 nations signaled support for the effort, even if not every single one of them committed forces immediately. The United Kingdom emerged as one of the most concrete partners in that coalition, fitting Royal Fleet auxiliary support vessels with autonomous mine-hunting drones and unmanned surface vehicles specifically designed to locate and safely trigger sea mines from a distance, addressing that first layer of Iran's strategy directly. Britain also committed the Type 45 destroyer HMS Dragon to the effort and provided airbase support for continued American operations in the region. So what you actually had by the time this campaign hit full stride wasn't just the U.S. Navy against the IRGC. It was a genuinely multinational coalition, combining American robotic strike boats and bunker-busting air power with Allied mine clearance technology and additional naval escort capacity, all converging on the exact same choke point at the exact same time. It's also worth understanding exactly why the GARC platform was such a difficult problem for Iranian planners to solve once it actually got deployed at scale. Because the value of that system goes well beyond just having eyes on the water. These boats were built with a 5-meter hull, a beam of just under 2 meters, a full load displacement of roughly 4,800 pounds, carrying up to 1,000 pounds of payload on 163 gallons of diesel and a 200 horsepower engine. That's a design specifically optimized for endurance and persistence rather than raw speed or firepower. And that's exactly the point. A 5-meter craft with autonomous control, meaningful payload margin, and long endurance is perfectly suited to shadowing fast inshore attack craft, investigating suspicious contacts before they ever get close enough to matter, extending a mesh communications network across a wide stretch of water, and queuing manned ships or aircraft the instant something worth engaging shows up. Because the manufacturer also builds in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance functionality, along with communications relay and the ability to deploy smaller offboard drones from the hull itself, the boat functions less like a disposable one-way attack craft and more like a distributed sensor node and gateway, feeding a constant stream of tracking data back into the broader network rather than existing purely to blow up on contact. That's a far more sustainable role for daily patrol work around a choke point like Hormuz than a purely kamikaze concept would ever be. Because you can keep that boat on station indefinitely instead of burning through your inventory every time you actually need eyes on a suspicious contact. And this entire program didn't appear out of nowhere the moment this conflict started, which is honestly the part that should worry anyone still relying on a swarm-based doctrine going forward. Fifth Fleet stood up Task Force 59 back in September of 2021 specifically to accelerate unmanned and artificial intelligence integration across the fleet. And that task force ran an exercise called Digital Horizon the following year, specifically to test multiple different unmanned systems and push toward an actual standing unmanned surface fleet instead of a handful of experimental prototypes sitting in a research lab somewhere. GARC's own development continued maturing through 2025. Including integration work during exercises alongside manned destroyers like the USS Cole, testing exactly the kind of manned-unmanned teaming concept that ended up being so effective once this conflict actually broke out. None of that development path was smooth sailing, if you'll forgive the pun. There were real technical setbacks, including collision incidents and software integration problems during earlier testing phases, and operational reliability concerns that slowed the program down more than once. This wasn't some flawless overnight success story dreamed up in a panic once Iran closed the strait. It was a genuinely difficult, multi-year engineering effort that hit real turbulence and kept getting refined anyway, right up until the exact moment it was needed most, when it finally got validated in a live combat environment against a real, determined adversary instead of just a training range. And this is where it's worth stepping back and actually doing the strategic analysis on why Iran's swarm doctrine, something that had genuinely worked as a deterrent for years, fell apart this quickly once it actually got tested at scale against a determined, technologically superior, and increasingly coalition-backed response. The swarm doctrine was never actually designed to defeat the United States Navy outright. Nobody in Tehran ever seriously believed 100 small boats were going to sink a carrier strike group through raw numbers alone. The real purpose of the swarm was always about cost imposition and deterrence, making any attempt to challenge Iranian control of the strait expensive enough, chaotic enough and risky enough that adversaries would think twice before trying. It's a strategy built around asymmetric psychological and economic pressure as much as actual combat effectiveness. And that kind of strategy works brilliantly right up until the moment your opponent decides the cost of dismantling it is worth paying and shows up with exactly the right combination of tools to do it methodically instead of trying to match you boat for boat. That's the part Iran's own planning seems to have underestimated.